My name's Dr. Francesca Baylis, and I'll be talking to you all today a little bit about the significance of soil and sort of how it relates to carbon and carbon storage. To give a little bit of background, I completed my PhD in soil microbial management in January now, and I currently work for Kent County Council as an Environment Project Officer. So to start off with, I'm just going to give a little bit of a background about the soil, what it is, and how it stores carbon. So first off, what is soil? So you can see here this lovely diagram of some grass and some roots and some soil. And that pie chart there kind of represents the different components that you will see within soil. So this pinky sort of section here, that's your mineral components. And that sort of includes your sand, your silt, your clay, and it's kind of the particle aspect of soil. So what you'll expect to kind of pick up and sort of see. Over here, this sort of whiter quarter, that's air. The blue section here is water. And then this dark brown bit here will be something called organic matter. And that's sort of the bit that we're most interested in when it comes to carbon. What you'll tend to find is that these mineral components will form sort of like clumps together, which will tell you what type of soil you have. And then where these clumps don't fit perfectly together, you'll get something called soil pores. And within the soil pores is where you'll tend to find a lot of the water and the air. But that isn't the only part of soil that we need to be looking at. So what's a bit more important is around these roots. And you'll see this area that I've kind of laid out here around the root. That's something called the rhizosphere. And what that is when plants produce carbon through photosynthesis, the roots aren't perfect. And so all the sap filled with all sugars and carbon that the plant is storing will leak out of these roots and into the soil. And that's what this sort of area of the rhizosphere sort of represents. But it also includes sort of the surface of the root and within the root itself. And what you'll find is that within this rhizosphere, you'll find 10 to 1,000 times more bacteria than in the other parts of the soil. And the rhizosphere also tends to be the best part of the soil for nutrient cycling and for microbes, as well as other sort of soil life. So when we look a bit closer at this rhizosphere, you'll see loads and loads of different microbial diversity. So this bit here is the root, and in here you can see something called an arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi. These form associations with about 80% of plant species, except for stuff like cabbage, which is always a bit odd. But what these do is these live within the roots, and they help the plant to take up extra nutrients from the soil in exchange for a little bit of carbon. Here you can see things like actinomyces, which are kind of a form of bacteria that just kind of sit in the soil. You'll have your free living bacteria, which can kind of float around or move around in the soil and sort of interact with the roots. And you'll also have things like free living fungi, which don't have to live within the root, but which still feed off of these root exudates. So all of these microbes will live and feed in the rhizosphere. They'll interact with organisms, with the plants, and kind of help form this community. And they're also quite important in the carbon storage, but I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. A big thing to remember about soil is that soil is a non-renewable resource. It takes 100 years to generate 1 centimetre of topsoil, and so it needs to be managed well. You'll also see that a quarter of Earth's biodiversity is held within the soil, so we really need to make sure that it's being looked after in order to protect this biodiversity. A common thing that we often see is people talking about soil health, and that's defined by the Environment Agency as the continued capacity of soil to function as a vital ecosystem that sustains plants, animals, and humans. So that's a bit of a mouthful. But soil health is a combination of sort of the physical, chemical, and biological components of soil. So both the soil structure, the soil chemistry, and all of these animals and microorganisms that live within it. Some of the factors that people look at when talking about soil health include the nutrients and the nutrient content of the soil, the acidity, the organic matter, the structure itself, so whether it's more clayey or sandy, the water capacity and how well it infiltrates, as well as sort of biological activity and pollution. What this means is that it can be really difficult to quantify because there are so many different components and different aspects needed for the soil to function effectively. And it can also really vary depending on the types of soil being considered. So a healthy heathland, for example, will look very different to an arable soil. And so they have very different parameters that we need to look at. So what carbon is actually in the soil? Some of you may be familiar with the carbon cycle that's shown on the right here. However, the cycle's overly simplified and doesn't really emphasize how important soil is within carbon cycling. So the Environment Agency State of Environment report for soil states that soil holds 3 times as much carbon as the atmosphere, and UK soil alone is thought to hold 10 billion tonnes of carbon. Soil is also considered the most stable reservoir of carbon in terrestrial ecosystems, so it's quite an important factor. So carbon is normally deposited in the soil as organic matter, and organic matter is the key, kind of the bit of soil that makes it look all dark and rich and composty. So what you want your soil to look like when you're trying to grow things. There are 3 types. So the living matter, which is stored in the plants and microbes and will remain in place until they die. So that's just all the sort of carbons and sugars that are held within these. Once they die, they will then be part of the active organic matter, and that's sort of recently dead organisms, root exudates, manure, and sort of crop residues. And that's the part that sort of most microbes and other things organisms will eat. And so some of it will be released back into the atmosphere through respiration, but other parts will then be redeposited into the soil. And a lot of that will then become the stable organic matter, which is often called the humus. Which is the fresh organic matter, which is what the fresh organic matter becomes once it's been decomposed. And that's the carbon that will stay in the soil for a long time. However, science is showing that soils are losing their stored carbon through current management techniques. In particular, intensive agriculture in arable soils has been responsible for a loss of 40 to 60% of organic matter in these soils. Currently 4 million hectares of UK soils are at risk of compaction, and 2 million hectares are at risk of soil erosion. And DEFRA research by Cranfield University calculated the quantifiable soil degradation cost to the UK as 1.2 billion in 2010, of which 47% was associated with the loss of organic carbon in the soil. But that doesn't include all of those unquantifiable costs that we haven't yet managed to quantify. So I'd expect that cost to actually be bigger. So most of the soil carbon is in permafrost, peat, and generally regions with more rainfall, especially things like wetlands. And that's just because you'd find a lot more sort of carbon in sort of soils around the UK than you would in sort of a desert and things like that. So now we're going to go through a couple of the threats to soil. So this graph here was made by the Environment Agency for their State of the Environment for Soil report. And you can see here that they've shown quite a significant cost, annual cost in millions for the types of soil degradation. And the majority of these costs are from the greenhouse gas sort of aspect that soil can provide. And the largest portion that kind of contributes to that is the loss of organic carbon. So loss of organic carbon can be caused by lots of different factors. A big one is ploughing. So over half of the soil carbon in the soil is in the top 30 centimetres. So when you plough and establish grassland or temporary crops, this tends to reduce soil organic matter because it's then exposed to the atmosphere and can effectively be released back out. You'll also find that things like planting monocultures, so when you plant all of the same types, all of the crops in an area as the same type of plant, this can have a significant impact, especially as some plants are better for sort of storing soil carbon than others. There's also things like the loss of crop residues. Crop residues are the bits that are left over after a harvest. So if you were to cut down like a field of wheat, you'll often get stalks left in the ground. And if those are left to kind of rot back into the soil, you'll get carbon going back into the soil. But if they're sort of pulled up and taken away, then you're losing that carbon which would have otherwise gone back into the soil. And you'll also see this with stuff like mowing grass. When you take away clippings, it prevents that carbon from going back into the soil. And sort of the last thing that you'll see for the loss of organic carbon, though it's not necessarily, well, There's also deforestation, which obviously is a thing in the UK. But there's also loss of permafrost, which I don't think we have quite as much happening here, but is still a problem around the world. The next sort of type of degradation that we're going to look at is compaction. And what compaction is sort of a pressing down of the soil, creating a harder surface. So what I mentioned earlier about pore sizes, the space between particles, when compaction takes place, this will be reduced, and it kind of reduces the amount of air which can get into the soil. So that's not great in terms of the types of microbes that can live there, because there are two types of microbes. There are aerobic microbes which rely on oxygen, and then there are anaerobic microbes which don't need oxygen to live. If you are sort of taking the oxygen out of the soil, then you're effectively limiting how many aerobic microbes can live there and sort of pushing it more towards the anaerobic. And a lot of those which kind of help to decompose plants and animal matter into organic matter tend to be aerobic. You'll also find that it can sort of stop the movement of soil organisms through the soil because the soil is too hard for them to move through. So that's things like your earthworms and your beetles. And you'll also find that it might stop the plant roots from being able to get as far into the soil. Now that's significant just because when we talk about our living organic matter, that includes sort of the roots of plants. And if those can kind of get deeper into the soil, that's moving more and more carbon deeper into the soil too. So if you're sort of in really compacted soil and the roots are kind of held at the surface of the soil, that's not helping to move that carbon further into the soil into a more secure position. Erosion is also listed, and that can affect soil organic carbon, mainly because all of that lovely organic matter that you're storing into the soil can be carried in runoff of water along the surface of the fields or of the land, and that can kind of be taken away from the soil where it was originally formed. There's two other factors here. So sealing, and what that refers to is sort of almost like so when people put down sort of concrete and various other impermeable surfaces on top of the soil, which kind of prevents it from interacting with the air above it, and also loss of soil biota. And soil biota tends to refer to sort of microbes. And what you'll find is that there's nothing listed for those, just because we don't actually know what cost impact these are having. So we know that the loss of soil biota and we know that sealing are having a degradation effect on the soil, but we don't know how much this is costing our economy yet. But just because we don't know that yet, it doesn't mean that we shouldn't still be aware of them and still be thinking about them, because technology is changing quite a lot at the moment, particularly for microbiology, and it's now a lot easier to kind of quantify what microbes are available and the different diversity of this. So in the next few years, I'd expect to see a lot more data sort of emerging on these. So how can the soil be managed for carbon? So the main sort of way that we'll look to do this is normally through organic matter increases. So this can be done through quite a variety of techniques. Planting crops with deeper root lengths or with varied root lengths can really help to put more carbon deeper into the soil. So I mentioned this briefly earlier, but most carbon is stored in the top 20% of the soil, and deeper roots will help to move that further down into the soil. And most of that will originally be in the form of living organic matter, but as these are eventually dying and decomposing, you'll see an increase in the amount of active and stable organic matter there. And that tends to be a bit more persistent when it's further away from the surface. However, you will want to have a diverse range of different plants and different root lengths to get the maximum benefit. The next way is sort of to prevent disturbance, and you'll often hear people talk a lot about something called no-till farming. And the idea of this is to sort of prevent ploughing and soil disturbance, so anything which will kind of dig up the surface and allow more carbon to escape. And a lot of this comes down to the fact that microbes and plants will release these carbon molecules, which are called aggregates. And what those do is they help to bind together the mineral components of the soil and sort of make it into little clumps. So when you plough or disturb the soil, you tend to kind of break these down, which not only releases a bit more carbon, but also kind of breaks down quite a lot of the soil structure. So you can encourage soil microbes, and I've just sort of mentioned about how they can release aggregates, but also they play a really important part in decomposing things and helping to increase this stable organic matter. So it's worth noting that microbes do eat some of the carbon in the soil, yes, and they do respire it and release it back to the atmosphere. But the benefits they provide in terms of breaking down organic matter and helping turn it into longer, more stable more stable organic matter in the soil, and the other benefits they can provide for plants and biodiversity far outweigh sort of this amount that will be lost. Microbes can also help to enhance other factors, such as reducing the use of synthetic fertilizers. So when you use microbial inoculants or plant growth promoting rhizobacteria or mycorrhizal fungi, these can help to reduce the amount of fertilizer that is needed for different crops and plants, and so can also help with carbon storage that way. But it is worth saying that some microbes will be far better at helping with carbon storage than others, and there tends to be quite a lot of focus on fungi for this. So there's quite a lot of stuff at the moment on cover crops. So cover crops are great because they sort of do what they say, they cover the surface of the soil and prevent soil erosion. But also, if there's no plants in the soil that are producing root exudates for the microbes to eat, then they might sometimes eat some of the other carbon in the soil. So it's always good to make sure that you've got food for your various organisms living in the soil. Green manure is kind of a type of cover crop, and it's a fast-growing plant. So once it's been used as a cover crop, it will tend to be turned over while still alive, and then sort of used as a fertilizer as it rots down into the soil. So that can be quite good. So reduce the use of chemicals and synthetic fertilizers. So this is really important because synthetic fertilizers reduce root exudates and therefore don't really support microbes or anything else in the soil. In fact, high phosphorus environments are known to sort of reduce the amount of mycorrhizal colonization in plants, and so that can also help to reduce your carbon sequestration. Reducing use of pesticides can also help your microbial community and sort of other organisms living in the soil. So you won't ever kill all of the microbes present by using pesticides, but you will really affect the diversity of what's present. And I don't think people always realise that when they are applying a fungicide for a specific disease, it will kill other fungi as well. It doesn't just kill the disease-causing ones. So you will lose some of those beneficial ones as well. So to do something a little bit less biology-based, currently there's lots of work looking at things like biochar and enhanced weathering. So biochar is when plant matter is being heated without air to make sort of a charcoal brick, and these will then be mixed into the soil. And the advantage of these is that they take centuries for the charcoal to break down, but they can also help with trapping nutrients and water in the soil. So there's quite a lot of research looking at that at the moment. Alternatively, enhanced weathering is where rocks that react with CO2 are broken down to smaller pieces and then spread on farmland. And this increases the surface area of the rocks and so allows them to more quickly absorb CO2. However, it takes quite a lot of energy to grind up the rocks, so we're not entirely sure how this will work in the long run, but it's something that a lot of people are kind of looking at the moment. And it's important to say that a lot of the ways to increase organic matter are already being done by farmers, because for them better soil tends to give better yields. However, there's more that can be done to sort of help them with this, and we can also look to follow their example on other land types. So the last thing I wanted to do was to go through a few of the soil policy and initiatives kind of out at the moment. So the DEFRA 25-year plan was calling for soils to be managed more sustainably by 2030 and to give soils a greater focus, kind of more equivalent to air and water. And following on from this, the agriculture bill, which is currently kind of going through Parliament, has included soils and outlined the beginning of something called ELMS. So I've listed ELMS separately. It's Environmental Land Management Scheme, which is currently out for consultation, in fact, until May. And what it's doing is looking to replace the Common Agricultural Policy and is hoping to pay public money for public goods to incentivise landowners to follow more environmental management schemes, really. So the discussion for that is open at the moment, so take a look if you're interested. They're trying to work out how it might work. So the Environment Agency have quite a lot of stuff on soil. They did their State of the Environment for Soil report, which was really good. The Committee for Climate Change put a PDF out on land use policies for Net Zero UK, and that sort of really called for an increase in low carbon farming practices for soils and livestock. And the last thing is sort of the 4 per 1,000 movement, and what that is it's looking for people to sign up to increase their organic matter by 0.4% per year. The government actually already signed up for this at COP21 in 2015, but there hasn't been so much done so far. But sort of things are starting to change, and as you can see, there's some interesting stuff coming out at the moment relating to soil. So thank you very much for listening. I'm not sure how we're doing questions, but please get in touch if you did want to discuss anything. Yeah, and thank you for taking the time to listen to my presentation. Have a nice day.